Hello and welcome back. Today, in the 15th Sunday of the year, we have the Gospel about the Good Samaritan. And it reminds me of an incident that happened in my own life way back decades ago now, back in the early 80s. And I was working in a homeless men's hostel in Brisbane. And it was a large organisation, and it would offer sleeping accommodation overnight for the homeless, and during the day it was also a drop-in centre where they could come and they could read, they could get a cup of coffee, they could get some hot meals, that kind of thing. And during that time, I would often sit and talk, have a conversation with the fellows that came in. And I remember one guy, and this would have been 1984, and he came in and he'd just been discharged from hospital. He had a couple of nights before, he had taken an overdose of sleeping pills and slit his wrists. And he was rushed off to hospital. They pumped his stomach, they sewed up his wrists. And when he left, he was telling me that as he left the hospital, as they discharged him, one of the staff came up and said, "Now, next time you try to do this, this is the way to do it." And he showed him how to slit his wrist properly, which kind of was shocking to me at the time. And as I was talking to this fellow, I realised, I suppose, that the hospital staff kind of feel exasperated with this kind of thing. But what they didn't know, perhaps, I don't know, was that this fellow was a Vietnam vet. And whether they were really understanding of this at the time or not, it's obvious in hindsight now that he was suffering from post-traumatic stress disorder. But regardless of what it was, whether it was a psychological condition that he needed help with, or whether it was something of his own doing, Jesus reminds us in the gospel today with the story of the Good Samaritan that when we see a person in need, we do what we can to help them. We don't ask them whether they brought this on themselves or not. The circumstances are irrelevant. What's important is that there is a brother or a sister there, and they're in need. And that was really the case with this guy as well. So when we come across people who need in our own society, whether it's refugees or whether it's somebody within our own circle that we come across, we shouldn't be saying to ourselves, well, I'm not going to help them because they brought it on themselves, or I'm not going to help them because they're not very likable, or whatever. If we see a need that another person has, then love demands that we do what we can to help. This is really at the heart of the story of the Good Samaritan, but it would have been a story that was shocking to the first hearers of this parable. It would have been offensive to them, in fact. The road from Jericho to Jerusalem was known to be a dangerous road. It was a place where robbers dwelt. And so the first impression people would have had on hearing this story of Jesus is, well, why is this man travelling alone? It's his own fault that he got mugged. And we can translate that into different things in our own society. Why did they do this? It's their own fault. They got what was coming. The fact that the priest and the Levite did not stop to help them would not have surprised those who were listening either, because to help a man that had been bashed half to death with all of the mess of blood and injury would have been to render themselves ritually unclean and therefore not able to participate in the temple worship. So that wouldn't have been a real surprise to them. It's a scandal to us, but would not have surprised Jesus' first listeners. What would have shocked them is that the Samaritan helped the Jewish man who'd been mugged, because Samaritans and Jews hated each other. If a Samaritan came along and saw a half-dead Jew, those first hearers would have expected that he would have finished the job and killed the injured man. But instead he puts his own life at risk, and he actually does. He's not just putting himself out, he's putting his own life at risk by stopping and helping the injured man. So he puts himself out, he puts his own life at risk, and he uses his own resources to save the man. He doesn't care whether he's a Samaritan or a Jew. He just sees a person in need. This would have been deeply offensive to Jesus' first hearers, that a hated Samaritan would be the one to help a Jew. This would be like you or I suppose, finding a badly injured terrorist after everything that's gone on in our society, out in the middle of nowhere somewhere. And instead of killing him, we tend to his injuries and we nurse him back to health. What would you do in such circumstances? What would I do? And yet Jesus is teaching us that we are called to show compassion to all, regardless of their circumstances, because God shows us compassion, and that's revealed to us in the birth, life, death, and resurrection of Christ. We don't ask questions, we just help when we see people who need it. Now, you might think to yourself, well, I don't come across such spectacular incidences, but what's our attitude to the homeless today in our own society? Or what's our attitude to alcoholics or drug addicts? What's our attitude to refugees or our own Indigenous First Nations peoples? What's our attitude to people who rub us up the wrong way? Are we willing to help them in their needs? So I guess the question that comes out of this parable today that Jesus teaches us, he asks the question, who are the people in our society, in your life, that we absolve ourselves from being compassionate towards? And we can go through that list that I just went through again. So in your life today, in the circumstances of your existence, as you hear this reading at the New Covenant, at the Mass on Sunday, who is Christ calling you to be the Good Samaritan for? God bless and have a wonderful week.